The morning Josephine Hart watched the creek behind her homestead turn into a roaring monster. She knew her entire world was about to wash away with the muddy waters that churned and frothed like something alive and angry. It was spring of 1878 in the Arizona Territory, and the snowmelt from the mountains combined with 3 days of relentless rain had transformed the gentle stream into a raging torrent that clawed at the banks and swallowed everything in its path. She stood on her back porch, 22 years old and alone, watching the chicken coop she had built with her own hands tilt dangerously as the water undermined its foundation. Inside that coop was Napoleon, her prize rooster, a magnificent bird with copper and black feathers that shimmered like burnished metal in the sunlight. The rooster her late father had given her 2 years before he died of fever. The water was rising faster than she had thought possible. Josephine hitched up her skirts and ran toward the coop, her boots squelching in the saturated earth. But the current had already reached the structure, and she could hear Napoleon crowing frantically, a sound of pure terror that cut through the thunder of rushing water. She was 10 feet away when the entire coop lurched sideways, timbers groaning, and then it broke free from its moorings and began to tumble into the flood. Josephine screamed and lunged forward, but strong hands grabbed her around the waist and hauled her backward just as the ground where she had been standing collapsed into the churning brown water. "Are you trying to kill yourself?" A deep voice demanded in her ear, and she twisted in the iron grip to see a man she had never met before, a cowboy by the look of him, with dark hair plastered to his forehead by the rain and gray eyes that flashed with a mixture of alarm and exasperation. He was tall and lean, probably close to her own age, with the weathered look of someone who spent his life outdoors. His clothes were soaked through, and he was breathing hard as though he had been running. The rooster. Josephine gasped, pointing at the coop that was now spinning in the current, moving rapidly downstream toward where the creek joined the larger wash. "I have to save him." The cowboy looked at her as though she had lost her mind, which perhaps she had. But then he looked at the tumbling coop, and something shifted in his expression. Without a word, he released her and sprinted along the bank, moving parallel to the flood with a speed and grace that reminded Josephine of a mountain lion. She chased after him, her heart pounding so hard she thought it might burst from her chest, and she saw him calculating angles and distances, his eyes never leaving the coop that was being battered against rocks and debris. The creek made a sharp bend ahead, and the cowboy seemed to be aiming for that point. He reached a large cottonwood tree that leaned out over the water, its roots exposed by erosion, and without hesitation, he grabbed a low branch and swung himself out over the flood. Josephine arrived at the tree just in time to see him drop onto what remained of the coop's roof as it swept past beneath him. The impact nearly sent him into the water, but he managed to hook his arm through a gap in the shattered wood and hold on. The whole structure dipped under the surface for a terrifying moment before bobbing back up, and Josephine saw the cowboy reach down into the interior, his face set in fierce concentration. The coop hit a massive boulder with a crack that Josephine heard even over the roar of the flood. The cowboy was thrown clear, but he came up with one arm raised high above the water, and clutched in his hand was Napoleon, waterlogged and bedraggled but alive, his beak open in a silent protest. The cowboy struck out for the shore with his free arm, fighting the current that wanted to drag him downstream. Josephine ran along the bank, keeping pace, and when he managed to angle himself into a small eddy near the shore, she waded into the shallower water and grabbed his outstretched hand. Together they hauled themselves onto solid ground, both of them gasping for breath, and the cowboy gently deposited Napoleon on the muddy earth. The rooster shook himself vigorously, spraying water in all directions, and then he looked up at the cowboy and let out a loud, indignant crow that said more clearly than words what he thought about his recent ordeal. It was so absurd, so perfectly Napoleon, that Josephine felt laughter bubble up in her throat even as tears streamed down her face. She did not know if she was crying from relief or fear, or the delayed shock of nearly losing everything. But she could not stop the sounds that came from her, half sobs and half laughter, her whole body shaking with the force of her emotions. The cowboy was sitting in the mud, his chest heaving, water streaming from his hair and clothes, and he looked at her with those gray eyes that seemed to see right through her defenses. Josephine did not think, did not plan. She simply threw her arms around his neck and kissed his cheek, tasting rain and river water and something else, something warm and alive and real. His skin was cold from the flood, but his cheek warmed under her lips, and when she pulled back, she saw surprise and something softer in his expression. "Thank you," she whispered, her voice breaking on the words. "Thank you for saving him. He is all I have left of my father." The cowboy reached up and touched his cheek where she had kissed him, a gesture so unconscious and wondering that it made Josephine's heart squeeze in her chest. "Ma'am," he said, and his voice was rough with emotion or exhaustion or both. "I have done some foolish things in my life, but jumping into a flash flood for a chicken might just take the prize, though I reckon he is a fine bird." Napoleon chose that moment to shake himself again, and then strut over to peck experimentally at the cowboy's boot, as though assessing whether this strange human who had saved him was worthy of his regard. The cowboy laughed, a sound that started low in his chest and built into something genuine and warm, and Josephine found herself laughing too, the tension breaking like a fever. "I am Josephine Hart," she said when she could speak again. "This is my homestead, or what is left of it." "Cole Branson," the cowboy replied, getting to his feet and offering her his hand to help her up. His grip was strong and calloused, the hand of someone who worked hard for his living. "I was riding through when I saw the flood coming, tried to warn folks downstream. Saw you about to jump into that water and figured I had better stop you before you got yourself killed." Josephine looked back toward her homestead, and her heart sank. The chicken coop was completely gone now, vanished downstream, and the water was lapping at the back steps of her small house. The garden she had planted was under several feet of muddy water, and her storage shed had collapsed into a pile of waterlogged lumber. She had worked so hard to build this place after her father died, to prove she could survive on her own, and now it looked as though the land itself was determined to take it all back. "How bad is it downstream?" she asked, and she hated how small her voice sounded. Cole's expression grew serious. "Bad enough. The wash is over its banks, some of the homesteads on the flats are underwater, the town is rallying folks to higher ground." He hesitated, then added, "You cannot stay here, the water is still rising, you need to get to safety." Josephine wanted to argue, to insist that she could not leave her home, but she was not a fool. She could see the water creeping higher, and she knew that stubborn pride was a quick way to end up dead. She nodded, then scooped up Napoleon, who squawked in protest but allowed himself to be tucked under her arm. "Let me get some things from the house." She ran to the building with Cole following, and they worked quickly to gather what they could carry. Clothing, her father's pocket watch, the family Bible, a daguerreotype of her parents on their wedding day, a little money she kept hidden in a coffee tin. The water was coming through the floorboards by the time they finished, and Cole grabbed her free hand and pulled her toward the door. They made it to higher ground just as the sun broke through the clouds, sending shafts of golden light across the devastated landscape. From the rise, Josephine could see her house standing in what looked like a lake, the water swirling around the foundation. Other homesteaders were gathered there too, families with children and elderly folks, everyone staring at the destruction with expressions of shock and despair. Someone had started a fire, and people were huddling around it for warmth despite the fact that the day was not particularly cold. Shock did strange things to people. Cole found Josephine a spot near the fire and made sure she was settled before he moved through the crowd, checking on people, offering help where he could. She watched him work and realized he had a natural authority about him, the kind that made people trust him instinctively. He helped an old man who was coughing badly, gave his own jacket to a woman with a baby, found a piece of rope to secure someone's belongings that were threatening to slide down the muddy slope. Napoleon had recovered enough to demand attention, and Josephine held him close, stroking his wet feathers and murmuring nonsense words that comforted them both. A couple of hours later, wagons arrived from town with supplies and people willing to help. The water had stopped rising and was beginning to recede, leaving behind a mess of mud and debris that would take weeks to clean up. Josephine learned that several buildings in town had flooded, but no one had died, which felt like a miracle. Cole had saved a family of 5 who had been trapped on their roof, carrying the children across the current one by one before the adults made the crossing. He was a hero, people said, but when someone tried to tell him that, he just shook his head and said he had done what anyone would do. Night fell and people began to make rough camps on the high ground, unsure whether it was safe to return to their homes. Josephine sat wrapped in a borrowed blanket, Napoleon roosting on a makeshift perch Cole had fashioned from a broken branch, and watched the stars come out one by one in the clearing sky. It seemed impossible that the world could be so beautiful after such destruction, but there they were, those distant points of light, indifferent to human suffering and human joy alike. Cole appeared beside her with 2 tin cups of coffee, the good strong kind that could wake the dead, and settled onto the ground with a tired sigh. He had been working all day without rest, and Josephine could see the exhaustion in every line of his body. "You should sleep," she said softly. "So should you," he countered, handing her one of the cups. Their fingers brushed in the exchange, and Josephine felt a spark of awareness that had nothing to do with the cold or the danger they had survived. She sipped the coffee to cover her confusion, burning her tongue in the process. "Where are you from?" she asked, because she wanted to know everything about this man who had risked his life for a rooster he did not know, for a woman he had never met. "Originally, Texas," Cole said, staring into his cup as though he could read the future in the dark liquid. "My family had a ranch there, but we lost it after the war. I have been drifting since then, taking work where I can find it. Was heading to California, thought I might try my luck there." "Was," Josephine repeated, catching the past tense. Cole looked at her, and in the firelight his eyes were dark and unreadable. "Was," he confirmed. "Now I am thinking I might stay around here for a while. Seems like there will be plenty of work helping folks rebuild." Josephine's heart did a strange little jump in her chest. "The pay will not be very good," she warned. "Most of us barely get by in the best of times." "I am not much concerned with pay right now," Cole said quietly. "There are more important things than money." They talked long into the night, their voices low so as not to disturb the people sleeping around them. Josephine learned that Cole was 24, that he had served briefly in the army before being discharged after taking a bullet in his shoulder, that he liked his coffee black and his horses fast, that he could read and write, and had a particular fondness for the poetry of Walt Whitman, which surprised her. He learned that she was the only child of parents who had come west with dreams of starting fresh, that her mother had died in childbirth when Josephine was 10 and her father had raised her to be strong and independent, that she could shoot straight and cook a decent meal and had a stubborn streak a mile wide. They laughed together and fell silent together, and when Josephine finally dozed off with her head on her knees, she woke to find Cole's coat draped over her shoulders and the man himself keeping watch, making sure everyone stayed safe through the night. The next days were a blur of hard work and harder decisions. The water receded as quickly as it had risen, leaving behind a layer of mud and silt that covered everything. Josephine's house was still standing, but the interior was a disaster, everything on the ground floor ruined by water damage. The garden was destroyed, her tools scattered across the landscape or buried in mud. She wanted to cry, but there was no time for tears, only work. Cole appeared at first light with tools borrowed from town and started helping her muck out the house, hauling buckets of mud and water-damaged possessions. Other neighbors came to help too, because that was how people survived out here, by helping each other, and Josephine returned the favor by working on their places once her own house was habitable again. Cole stayed. He pitched a tent near her property and made himself useful, rebuilding her chicken coop with lumber salvaged from other damaged structures, helping repair her roof where the rain had found weak spots, constructing a new garden bed on higher ground. Napoleon followed Cole around like a devoted dog, which was strange because the rooster had never liked anyone except Josephine and her father. But Napoleon seemed to have decided that the man who pulled him from a flood deserved loyalty, and he would roost on Cole's shoulder while the cowboy worked, occasionally offering commentary in the form of soft clucks and crows. "You have made a friend," Josephine observed one afternoon, watching Cole measure boards for the new coop while Napoleon supervised from his perch. Cole glanced at the rooster and smiled, that slow, warm smile that made Josephine's stomach flutter. "He is good company, does not talk back much." "He is very talkative when he wants to be," Josephine said, "usually right before dawn when everyone is trying to sleep." "A rooster doing his job," Cole said approvingly, "cannot fault him for that." They fell into a rhythm over the following weeks. Cole would work on repairs during the day, sometimes taking jobs in town when people needed extra hands, always returning in the evening to help Josephine with whatever needed doing. She cooked meals for both of them, told herself it was only fair payment for his help, tried to ignore the way her heart lifted when she heard his footsteps on the porch. They talked about everything and nothing, their conversations ranging from the practical matters of homesteading to philosophy and dreams, and the kind of deep questions people ask when they are trying to understand the world and their place in it. One evening they sat on her newly repaired porch and watched the sunset paint the sky in shades of orange and purple and gold. Napoleon was roosting in his new coop, which was built on higher ground and reinforced to withstand the next flood. The garden had been replanted and was showing green shoots that promised eventual harvest. The house still needed work, but it was livable, and Josephine was starting to believe she might actually recover from the disaster. "I owe you so much," she said quietly, her hands folded in her lap. "I do not know how I can ever repay you for everything you have done." Cole was quiet for a long moment, his eyes on the horizon. When he spoke, his voice was careful, as though he was testing the weight of each word before releasing it into the air. "Josephine, I did not do this expecting payment. I did it because I wanted to, because I wanted to help you, because he stopped, seemed to struggle with something internal, then turned to look at her directly. "Because I cannot imagine being anywhere else." Josephine's breath caught in her throat. She knew what he was saying without him having to spell it out, knew because she felt the same way, had been feeling it for weeks but had been afraid to name it, afraid to hope. "Cole," she whispered, and his name on her lips felt like a prayer and a promise all at once. He reached out and took her hand, his thumb tracing gentle circles on her palm. "I know I do not have much to offer. I am just a drifter with no land and no prospects, but I am a hard worker and I am honest and I care about you more than I have ever cared about anyone. If you would consider letting me stay, letting me court you proper, I would count myself the luckiest man alive." Tears were streaming down Josephine's face again, but these were tears of joy, pure and uncomplicated. "You saved Napoleon," she said, and she knew she was not making sense, but she also knew he would understand. "You jumped into a flood to save my rooster and you have been here every day since, helping me rebuild. How could I not have fallen in love with you?" The words hung in the air between them, shimmering with possibility. Cole's eyes widened and then he smiled, that beautiful warm smile, and he leaned forward slowly, giving her time to pull away if she wanted. But Josephine did not want to pull away. She wanted to move closer, to close the distance between them, and when their lips met, it was like coming home after a long journey. The kiss was sweet and gentle and full of promise, and when they finally broke apart, both of them were smiling like fools. "I love you too," Cole said, resting his forehead against hers. I think I have loved you since the moment you laughed through your tears and kissed my cheek. I just did not know how to tell you." "You just did," Josephine said and kissed him again. Courting in the Arizona Territory in 1878 was a serious business, governed by social conventions that even independent-minded homesteaders like Josephine could not entirely ignore. Cole moved his tent into town to maintain propriety, though he continued to work on Josephine's homestead during the day. He brought her flowers he picked from the desert, tough blooms that survived the harsh conditions. And once he brought her a book of poetry he had traded for in town, the Whitman she knew he loved. They attended church socials together and went to town dances, and Cole proved to be a surprisingly good dancer despite his claim that he had 2 left feet. Josephine wore her best dress, which was not saying much, but Cole looked at her as though she were wearing silk and diamonds, and that was worth more than any finery. The town gossips had plenty to say about the romance between the flood survivor and her rescuer. Some people thought it was wonderfully romantic, a love story born from disaster. Others muttered that it was too fast, that they barely knew each other, that Cole was probably just after her land. That last part made Josephine laugh, because anyone who wanted her modest homestead for its value was either desperate or delusional. But Cole never rose to the bait, never responded to the gossip with anything except patient good humor, and gradually even the skeptics were won over by the obvious sincerity of his devotion. 3 months after the flood, Cole asked Josephine to marry him. He did it properly, going down on one knee in her newly planted garden, Napoleon watching from his perch on the fence like a feathered chaperone. The ring was simple, just a thin band of silver, but Josephine loved it more than she would have loved the crown jewels. She said yes before he could even finish his prepared speech, and then she pulled him to his feet and kissed him while Napoleon crowed his approval. They were married in the small church in town on a warm day in late summer. Josephine wore her mother's wedding dress, which she had carefully preserved and which fit her almost perfectly with just a few alterations. Cole wore new clothes purchased for the occasion, and he looked so handsome that Josephine felt her heart might burst from happiness. The minister who performed the ceremony was an old circuit rider who had seen plenty of hardship in his years traveling the territory, and his blessing was simple but heartfelt. He spoke about the importance of partnership, about how marriage was 2 people choosing to face life's challenges together, about how love was not just a feeling but a commitment renewed every single day. The whole town turned out for the celebration afterward. There was food and music and dancing, and even the people who had been skeptical about the match seemed caught up in the joy of the day. An old rancher who had known Josephine's father pulled her aside at one point and said gruffly, "Your pa would have approved of this man. He is good people." That mattered to Josephine more than she could express, and she had to blink back tears as she thanked him. Cole and Josephine spent their wedding night in the homestead house, which was finally fully repaired and cleaner than it had been in years. They lay together in the darkness, wrapped in each other's arms, and talked about their dreams for the future. Cole wanted to expand the property, maybe buy some cattle, build a real ranch. Josephine wanted a family, children who would grow up knowing both the harshness and the beauty of this land. They made love slowly and tenderly, discovering each other with a patience born of genuine affection. And afterward, Josephine rested her head on Cole's chest and listened to the steady beat of his heart, and thought that she had never been happier. Life as a married couple brought its own challenges and rewards. The work of running a homestead was endless, from tending the garden to caring for the chickens to maintaining the buildings and fences. Cole took on additional work when he could find it, hiring himself out for roundups and trail drives, always returning to Josephine with the money he had earned and stories of his adventures. She kept the home fires burning, literally and figuratively, and slowly they began to build up their savings, planning for the future they both wanted. Napoleon remained a fixture of their daily life, still strutting around the property like he owned it, still following Cole around during the day. The rooster was getting older now, his feathers not quite as glossy as they had been, but he was still vigorous and proud. Cole built him a special perch in the barn where he could roost in comfort, and Napoleon would sit there in the evenings and watch the couple go about their work, occasionally offering a commentary that sounded suspiciously like approval. The first winter of their marriage was hard. The snows came early and stayed late, and there were times when they were snowed in for days at a stretch. But they had prepared well, laying in supplies and firewood, and Josephine found that being trapped in a small house with Cole was not a hardship but a gift. They played cards by the fire and read aloud to each other from the few books they owned, and made love under piles of blankets while the wind howled outside. Cole taught Josephine to play the harmonica, which he had owned since he was a boy, and she taught him to braid rope, a skill her father had passed on to her. They learned each other's rhythms and moods, learned when to give space and when to offer comfort, learned the thousand small compromises that make a marriage work. Spring came eventually, as it always did, bringing green grass and wildflowers and the promise of renewal. Josephine discovered she was pregnant in early April, and the joy on Cole's face when she told him was something she would remember for the rest of her life. He was terrified and thrilled in equal measure, constantly worrying about her health and whether they had enough money to support a child and what kind of father he would be. Josephine, who was also terrified and thrilled, reassured him as best she could, reminding him that people had been having babies on the frontier for generations and that they would figure it out together. The pregnancy was not easy. Josephine was sick for the first few months, barely able to keep food down, and Cole hovered over her like a mother hen, which would have been annoying if it had not been so endearing. As her belly grew, the work of the homestead became more difficult, and Cole took on more and more of the daily tasks, insisting that she rest and take care of herself. Neighbors helped too, women who had been through pregnancies of their own and knew how to offer practical assistance without making Josephine feel useless. Their son was born in December, during a cold snap that had ice forming on the inside of the windows. The birth was long and difficult, attended by the town midwife and 2 neighbor women, and there were moments when Josephine was sure she was going to die. But Cole was there the whole time, holding her hand, wiping her face with a cool cloth, telling her she was strong and brave and that he loved her more than life itself. And when the baby finally emerged, red-faced and squalling, and the midwife declared him healthy, Josephine looked at Cole's awestruck expression and knew that their life had just changed forever in the best possible way. They named him William after Josephine's father, but from the start everyone called him Billy. He was a big baby with a good set of lungs and his father's gray eyes, and Cole was instantly besotted. He would hold his son for hours, just staring at the tiny face, marveling at the miniature fingers and toes. Napoleon was deeply suspicious of the new arrival at first, but gradually he accepted Billy as part of the flock. And as the baby grew into a toddler, the old rooster would allow the child to pet him, a privilege he granted to no one else. The years passed, each one bringing its own joys and sorrows. There were good years when the rain came at the right times and the garden flourished, and the few head of cattle they had managed to acquire thrived. There were hard years when drought parched the land and they had to watch every penny and wondered if they would make it through. But they faced everything together, Cole and Josephine, partners in the truest sense of the word. They added to their family, a daughter named Sarah born 2 years after Billy, and then another son, James, 2 years after that. The house that had once seemed adequate for one person was now bursting at the seams with children and noise and life. Cole proved to be an excellent father, patient and firm and endlessly creative in finding ways to entertain the children. He taught Billy to ride almost before the boy could walk, built Sarah a dollhouse from scrap wood that was more beautiful than anything you could buy in a store, carried baby James in a sling on his chest while he worked so the child would not be separated from him. Josephine watched her husband with their children and fell in love with him all over again, seeing facets of his character she had not known existed. Napoleon lived to be 15 years old, an extraordinary age for a rooster, and when he finally died peacefully in his sleep one spring night, the whole family mourned. They buried him in a spot near the garden with a marker coal carved from wood, and even the children who had never known a time before Napoleon cried at his passing. "He was a good bird," Cole said simply, his arm around Josephine's shoulders as they stood over the small grave. "Loyal and brave and true, we were lucky to have him." "You saved him," Josephine said, as she had said many times over the years. "You saved him and you saved me." Cole pulled her close and kissed the top of her head. "We saved each other," he corrected gently. "That is what love does." The homestead grew and prospered over the decades. Cole was as good as his word about being a hard worker, and he had a knack for ranching that turned their modest property into something more substantial. They never became wealthy, but they were comfortable, and that was more than many people could say. Billy grew up to be a rancher like his father, taking over more and more of the operation as Cole got older. Sarah married a shopkeeper in town and gave Josephine and Cole their first grandchildren. James, the youngest, had a wandering spirit and eventually headed to California to seek his fortune, though he wrote faithfully and came home for visits. As they aged, Cole and Josephine spent more time on the porch they had sat on that first evening when he told her he loved her. They would sit in rocking chairs Cole had built with his own hands and watch the sunset and talk about everything and nothing, just as they had always done. Their hair turned gray and their bodies grew stiff with age, but their love remained strong, tested by time and hardship and proven true. On their 30th wedding anniversary, their children and grandchildren gathered at the homestead for a celebration. There was so much food that the table groaned under the weight of it, and so much laughter that it seemed to echo off the mountains. Billy proposed a toast to his parents, talking about how they had built something beautiful and lasting out of nothing but hard work and love. Sarah told the story of the flood and the rooster, which the grandchildren had heard 100 times but never tired of. James read a poem, one by Whitman that Cole had loved, his voice catching on the words. That night, after everyone had gone to bed, Cole and Josephine sat on the porch under a sky full of stars. "Do you ever regret it?" Cole asked quietly, "marrying a drifter with no prospects?" Josephine took his hand, the same hand he had offered her 3 decades ago, now gnarled with arthritis but still strong. "Not for one single moment," she said firmly. "You are the best thing that ever happened to me, Cole Branson. You jumped into a flood to save my rooster, and you never stopped saving me every single day since." Cole smiled, that same warm smile that still made her heart flutter after all these years. "You gave me a home when I had been drifting for so long I had forgotten what that felt like. You gave me a family and a purpose, and a reason to get up every morning. I am the one who was saved, Josephine." They sat in comfortable silence for a while, holding hands and watching the stars wheel overhead. The desert night was cool and clear, and somewhere in the distance a coyote sang its lonely song. The homestead was quiet around them, the children and grandchildren sleeping, the cattle settled, the chickens roosting. Everything they had built together, solid and real and lasting. "I love you," Josephine said softly. "I love you too," Cole replied. "Always have, always will." They remained on the frontier that had shaped them, growing old together in the house they had built, raising their family and watching their grandchildren grow. Cole never lost his ability to make Josephine laugh, and she never stopped being amazed by his steadfast devotion. The flood that had brought them together became family legend, the story told and retold until it took on the quality of myth. But to Cole and Josephine, it was simply the beginning, the moment when 2 lonely people found each other in the chaos and decided to face the future hand in hand. When Cole was 70 years old, he took sick with pneumonia during a particularly harsh winter. The doctor came from town and did what he could, but everyone knew that sometimes age and illness were stronger than medicine. Josephine nursed him day and night, refusing to leave his side, and their children took turns sitting vigil. On the third night, when the fever was at its worst, Cole opened his eyes and looked at Josephine with perfect clarity. "Do not grieve too long," he said, his voice weak but steady. "We had a good life, the best life." "We did," Josephine agreed, tears streaming down her face. "We do." But Cole rallied. The fever broke and he began to recover, slowly but surely, until the doctor proclaimed it a miracle. Josephine knew it was not a miracle but pure stubbornness, Cole refusing to leave her because their story was not finished yet. He grew strong enough to walk again, to sit on the porch, to hold his great-grandchildren when they came to visit. He lived to be 78 years old, and when he finally passed away peacefully in his sleep, Josephine was holding his hand, as she had held it through 3 decades of marriage and all the joys and sorrows that came with it. Josephine lived another 5 years after Cole died. She stayed on the homestead, refusing her children's offers to move into town, insisting that this was her home and she would not leave it. She spent her days tending the garden and visiting with grandchildren and great-grandchildren, telling them stories about the old days, about the flood and the rooster and the cowboy who saved them both. She spoke about Cole constantly, keeping his memory alive through her words, and anyone who listened could hear the love in her voice, undiminished by death or time. When Josephine Hart Branson passed away in her sleep at the age of 82, her family buried her next to Cole on a rise overlooking the homestead they had built together. The marker was simple granite, carved with both their names and the dates of their births and deaths, and one line beneath. Together they built a life of love. Not far away was another, smaller marker for Napoleon, the rooster who had inadvertently brought them together, and the whole family agreed that was fitting. The homestead stayed in the family for generations, passed down from parent to child, each generation adding their own touches while respecting the foundation Cole and Josephine had laid. The story of the flood and the rescue and the love that grew from it became part of the family's identity, a reminder that sometimes the worst disasters can lead to the greatest blessings, that courage and kindness matter more than wealth or status, and that true love, once found, can weather any storm. In the end, it was a simple story, really. A cowboy rescued a rooster from a flood. A woman laughed through tears and kissed his cheek. And from that moment, 2 lives intertwined and became one, building something beautiful that lasted long after they were gone. It was a story of the Wild West, of hardship and perseverance, of the kind of love that does not exist in fairy tales but in the real world, where people work hard and sacrifice for each other, and choose each other again and again, day after day, year after year, until death parts them, and even then not really, because love like that echoes through generations, shaping the future in ways both seen and unseen. The land remembered them, the homestead remembered them, the family remembered them. And somewhere in the vast Arizona sky, under stars that had witnessed their first kiss and their last goodbye, their story continued to live, as vivid and real as the day a young cowboy jumped into a raging flood to save a prize rooster, and found, in the process, the love of his life and a home he had been searching for without even knowing it. That was the story of Cole and Josephine Branson, and it was a story worth telling, worth remembering, worth holding close to the heart as proof that even in the hardest times, in the wildest places, love could bloom and flourish and last forever.